Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Global Insight News. Tonight, we begin with a news that is not only deeply disturbing, but also emblematic of the growing tensions surrounding immigration enforcement in America. This is a news about violence against law enforcement, about rising hostilities in major American cities, and about the risks faced every single day by those who are tasked with carrying out our nation's immigration laws. It's a news that has sparked outrage, ignited debate, and left many wondering whether our institutions are fully prepared for the intensity of opposition they now face. The events unfolded in San Francisco, one of America's most prominent and politically charged cities. Federal officials say a violent mob targeted immigration and customs enforcement agents, commonly known as ICE, in an attack that could have easily turned deadly. According to the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, 4 federal officers were surrounded, grabbed, punched, and even pepper-sprayed while conducting a targeted immigration enforcement operation. Think about that for a moment: federal officers, carrying out the lawful duties of the United States government, being physically attacked and threatened in broad daylight. It is the kind of image that shakes confidence in public safety and calls into question the very balance between protest and lawlessness. Officials say this was not a spontaneous outburst. Rather, it involved a group of around 15 to 20 demonstrators who gathered outside San Francisco's federal court building. The protesters were waiting for the release of a detainee identified by DHS as Adrian Angie Guerrero, a U.S. citizen who identifies as a woman. Guerrero, according to federal authorities, had allegedly threatened officers in shockingly explicit terms. DHS claims that Guerrero said directly to law enforcement, quote, "I'm going to go after your family, and I'm going to stab you." Now let's pause here. Threatening federal officers is not only a crime, it is a direct challenge to the authority of government institutions that keep order in society. DHS further reported that Guerrero was found in possession of a black knife and a patterned headscarf at the time of the incident. Authorities also allege that Guerrero slashed the tire of a government vehicle, adding destruction of federal property to the list of charges. These are not minor allegations. They represent a pattern of behavior that federal officials say could have escalated to much more severe violence if not swiftly contained. Yet despite the severity of these accusations, Guerrero was granted bail and walked out of custody, immediately greeted by cheering supporters. Surrounded by demonstrators, Guerrero declared, quote, "I'm good." Despite the brutality and repression that the federal government is placing on this city, my city, the city I was born in. These words reflect a sentiment we are hearing more and more in certain parts of the country, a belief that federal immigration enforcement is itself a form of oppression, rather than a legitimate function of government. For DHS, however, the message is very different. The department stresses that ICE officers are increasingly under siege. They point to what they describe as a 1,000% increase in assaults against immigration enforcement personnel. Let's be clear, a 1,000% increase is not a statistical blip. It is a seismic shift in the climate of hostility surrounding these operations. DHS insists that despite these dangers, their officers will continue to carry out missions nationwide, targeting what they call the worst of the worst criminal illegal aliens. One official, speaking with unmistakable conviction, declared, "We're making Los Angeles and California a safer place. We're going to continue to do that, and they can take that one to the bank in cash." It was a bold statement, designed to reassure the public that despite rising attacks, enforcement efforts will not back down. But this incident in San Francisco raises broader questions about the landscape of American law and order. Let's explore that context. San Francisco has long been known as a city that prides itself on progressive policies, particularly when it comes to immigration. It is one of the most prominent so-called sanctuary cities, jurisdictions that limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. To supporters, sanctuary policies are about protecting immigrant communities from what they see as overly aggressive federal intrusion. To critics, however, these policies create a climate where hostility toward federal officers is tolerated, even encouraged. When protesters gather outside a federal courthouse to celebrate the release of someone accused of threatening to stab officers, critics argue that it sends the wrong signal. They say it emboldens others to view federal law enforcement not as protectors of public safety, but as enemies. And when those sentiments boil over into violence, as DHS says they did in this case, the results can be both dangerous and destabilizing. Let's dig deeper into the numbers. DHS has publicly stated that immigration enforcement personnel are now facing unprecedented levels of aggression. The figure they cite, a 1,000% increase in assaults, underscores the magnitude of the threat. Officers, whose job already involves risk, now face the added danger of being directly targeted by hostile groups. These are men and women who leave their families each day, not knowing whether they will come home safely. For them, the rising hostility is not an abstract policy debate. It is a reality they confront in the streets. And what about Guerrero? According to DHS, Guerrero's alleged actions, slashing a government tire, carrying a knife, threatening to attack families, cross multiple legal boundaries. The charges include assault and destruction of federal property, with potential penalties of up to 1 year in prison and a fine of as much as $100,000. Critics of the justice system argue that such a maximum penalty seems surprisingly light, given the nature of the alleged threats and violence. Some have expressed shock that Guerrero was able to walk free on bail so quickly, surrounded by cheering supporters, despite the gravity of the accusations. This is where the news becomes larger than one individual. It is about a clash of narratives. On one side, federal officials argue that their officers are under attack simply for doing their jobs that are essential to maintaining national security and the rule of law. On the other side, activists argue that ICE is part of a repressive system that targets vulnerable communities, and that resistance, even aggressive resistance, is justified. The clash is not new, but it appears to be intensifying. Across the United States, protests against immigration enforcement have grown louder and, in some cases, more confrontational. What happened in San Francisco is one incident, but DHS insists